is a privilege to have you here for a special evening celebrating 250 years of an enduring connection between the United States and Ireland. Few relationships have shaped the American story as deeply as the one between these two nations, although the Scottish sure tried their best over the last 2 weeks in Boston. They did a pretty good job. Irish immigrants helped build this country, its cities, its institutions, its labor movement, its political traditions, its culture, and its communities. But the story of Irish America is about more than immigration. It's a story of shared values, of resilience and hope, and of a belief that ordinary people can help bend history toward greater opportunity and justice. It's also a story that is deeply personal to many of us gathered here tonight, myself included. My family's story began when my great-great-great-grandfather, Patrick Kennedy, left Ireland and settled in Boston in the mid-19th century. Like so many Irish immigrants of that era, he arrived seeking opportunity and a better future for his family. What followed was not just the story of one family, but a chapter in the larger story of Irish America. A story of hard work, of sacrifice, of community, of faith, of a belief that each generation could build something stronger than the next. East Boston became home to thousands of Irish families who helped shape the city and, in many ways, the nation itself. Their experience reflected a broader journey of Irish immigrants across America, overcoming hardship, building communities, contributing to public life, and helping define the character of a country that they adapted as their own. And throughout American history, the ties between our countries have remained strong because they've always been guided or grounded, not simply by government-to-government relations, but people to people, in families, neighborhoods, schools, churches, businesses, communities that have connected our nations across generations and across oceans. Tonight's program is especially fitting here at the Kennedy Library, a place that stands both as an American institution and as a symbol of a profound connection between Ireland and the United States. I want to start by expressing a deep and abiding gratitude to the Government of Ireland for its long-standing partnership and support of this library's work. Their generosity has helped make possible important public programs and digitization efforts, including support for the Kennedy Family Photos Collection, allowing audiences around the world to engage and learn from its history. I also want to thank our Consulate General of Ireland in Boston, Sheila Fitzgerald, for her partnership in bringing tonight's program together, for her continued efforts to strengthen the ties between all of us. Sheila, thank you, as you always do so well. This evening's program is presented as part of the Kennedy Library Forum series, and I want to acknowledge the generous support of our forum underwriters, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Massachusetts Cultural Council and our exclusive media partner, GBH. We are fortunate tonight to be joined by outstanding leaders and scholars who have dedicated their careers to strengthening the understanding between the United States and Ireland. But it wouldn't be a true Irish celebration without some poetry and some song, and I promise I will do neither of those things. For that, we are in for a treat. Micheal and some traditional Irish music will join us a little bit later in the evening. But before we get there, we have the pleasure of having Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason, who has served as Ireland's ambassador to the United States since 2022 and is one of Ireland's most distinguished diplomats. Throughout her career, including service as Ireland's permanent representative to the United Nations, she's been a powerful advocate for diplomacy, for international cooperation, and human rights. She is also a dear, dear friend. When my grandmother passed away, and we were looking for a place to house 500 guests for a wee reception, Geraldine kindly offered her home. The last guest left there 2 nights ago. Thank you, Ambassador. Joining her in conversation is Professor Mary Murphy, Director of the Irish Institute at Boston College, whose scholarship and leadership have made significant contributions to our understanding of Irish politics, peace building, and the evolving relationship in Ireland, Europe, and the wider world. At a moment when our world can feel often divided, evenings like this remind us of the power of enduring friendships between nations and for the cultural, civic, and human bonds that sustain them. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in welcoming Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason and Professor Mary Murphy.
Good evening, everyone. You can hear me okay? No? Testing? You can hear me now. The lights are pretty blinding up here.
They are.
So I can see that you're nodding. Well, thank you all so much for being here this evening, and a particular thanks to Representative Kennedy for such charming words and such lovely introductions. There's definitely a bit of Irish charm there, I think.
I detected that myself.
It's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful space for what is a very important conversation, I think, where we can take a moment to reflect on the enduring relationship between Ireland and the United States over this 250-year period. And no better person to have this conversation with than the Irish Ambassador to the United States, Geraldine Byrne Nason. So we're going to have a chat for about 30 minutes or so about that relationship over time and how it's changed and evolved and how it might look going forward as well. So I'm going to jump straight in, but I'm going to go right back in time. And I'm going to start by asking, when and how did the story of Irish America begin? Because it began before 1776. And I suppose I'm thinking in particular of the 200,000 who left Ireland in the 1700s. And they were mainly from the Ulster Presbyterian tradition.
Yeah. Well, again, delighted to be here. Really, it's a privilege. Just sitting here with those, the name of John F. Kennedy behind me is, for me, somebody who represented Ireland all my life, an enormous privilege. And to be with Joe Kennedy, Representative Kennedy, who did Ireland great service under President Biden in Northern Ireland. Tremendous gratitude to you, Joe, and respect for what you did for the country I love best. So you're right. So to jump right back, typically the impression or the general perception is that Irish people came here mid-19th century destitute, and there's a bit of confusion about whoever came before and what they were. And quite frequently people say to me, I'm not really Irish, I'm Scotch-Irish, but I don't know what that means. And so, the reality is that from about 1717 to 1775, 250,000 roughly, Irish people, we were the island of Ireland, there was no border on the island of Ireland then. Irish people left from Ulster, from the province of Ulster, predominantly Ulster Presbyterians, and there were a couple of reasons why they left and came to the United States. Ironically, one of them was that they were subject to the same penal laws as Irish Catholics were at the time. So the objective of the penal laws introduced by the British authorities was essentially to disenfranchise Roman Catholics and, no property, not allowed to own a horse. But the dissenters, as they were called at the time, the Ulster Presbyterians, were subject to the same laws. So they sought refuge, basically, as generations much later of Irish did. The way in which they left Ireland was very linked to the commerce of Ireland at the time, and Irish linen, as we know, the linen factories in Northern Ireland and Belfast were huge. American flaxseed coming over in big vessels, the vessels going back largely empty. They took these dissenters, the Ulster Protestants, to the United States, where they settled. They also had been subject to some economic hardship because 100 years before our big famine, the crops were failing. So these were not leaving comfortable large houses behind, they were leaving also failing agricultural past. So they arrived with very little into the United States. They were known as Irish when they arrived. And so this whole idea of the Irish being determined as Scotch-Irish and then later as Irish only happened really in the 19th century when the Roman Catholics arrived in their droves, and we can talk about how they arrived later. But there was a distinction then being made. Neither were welcome, but by 100 years later, the dissenters, the Ulster Scots had sort of Ulster Irish had made their way. And so even to this day, in fact, Vice President Vance is a Scot, Ulster Scots Irish. And he also says, I'm Irish, but I'm really more Scottish. It's actually very close to being, these were people who settled in Ulster, left Ireland because of the penal laws, and then distinguished themselves later.
And there were some of those figures who arrived during that century who played a very important role in terms of the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July in 1776. And there's a huge amount of Irish connection to that.
There is. That's a whole generation of Irish that I have to admit, in my current role, I've been uncovering. It's like an onion, you're meeting them. I'll start with my favourite, which is somebody called Hercules Mulligan. I don't think you could make that name up if you tried. Hercules Mulligan. From Derry, the county outside Derry, he was a 43-year-old living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, but effectively was George Washington's best spy. He managed to marry into a British family. He was a tailor by profession. And he had the contract, I'm using modern terms to describe it, but he had the contract for the British Army uniforms and also kept a few bottles of whiskey as he was measuring the generals, and essentially had them talk about their plans and their thinking, and was a huge source of intelligence. And he, you know, it's not just sort of an entertaining story, but Washington so valued him that the day after Evacuation Day, when Washington had been on Broadway with all the troops, he went down to Pearl Street on the lower side of Manhattan to see Hercules Mulligan to thank him. And CIA are on record as saying they think he should rank as the first American spy, but he was very definitely an Irishman. Other names which are, you know, now more commonly known, of course, Andrew Jackson, first Ulster Scottish-Irish president. We also had James Hoban from County Kilkenny, who came out a little bit later, but also was the architect of the White House. Two names that I've become very attached to because I think they express how we were there in the foundational formation of the thoughts about the United States are Stephen Moylan of Cork and Charles Thompson of Derry, of Tyrone. Moylan of Cork, he came from a very wealthy merchant class in Cork, but became a very trusted advisor to Washington. And he is credited, and there's documentary evidence of this, as being the very first person to pen the United States of America, because of course the states were talked about as states, but he actually, in a letter to Washington, used the term the United States of America. The secretary of the Continental Congress, this man called Charles Thompson, was given the task not just of recording the congressional debate that was on about how they would shape this emerging United States of America, but how they would symbolize it, what it would look like in its essence to the public. So he designed the seal of the United States, and he also designed the term a pluribus unum. So those two men, for me, were very close to the heart of this strength and unity, bringing the United States together. And then the last one I'll mention, because I was with a group from Google yesterday, and I was saying, you know, around the time of the Declaration of Independence, printers were the technologists, and the person who printed the declaration, the first declaration was printed by John Dunlap.
That's right. Irishman
as well, from what we now call Northern Ireland. And within a week of his printing, and this, that first few copies of the Declaration, the British tried to make sure it did not get on ships because they didn't want them. The Declaration's going international, actually got to Ireland and was printed in the Kilkenny Herald or something a week later.
My goodness.
So they're some of my favourite. There are lots more if we had more time. But, yeah.
Well, if we move forward again and move on to a really a seminal moment in Ireland's history, which is, of course, the Great Famine, which was devastating in its consequences. It's 2 million, an estimated 2 million people left Ireland during that 10-year period, and another 1 million or so died back home in Ireland. But there were, of course, so many of them who left and came to these shores because the US at that time represented a safe haven and a place of opportunity. But maybe if you could talk about the experience of that particular generation and the legacy of that generation as well.
I mean, it really was a cataclysmic event, a period really, and I'm of the generation that believes we do have a biological memory of the famine. Even, people I know who spent very little time in Ireland are very moved by famine, and I always like to think that Ireland's commitment to human rights and food security and social justice is somehow rooted in that terrible period. It was 1845 to 1850, 52 roughly, that the major period when the potato crop, on which the whole population basically depended, completely failed. Although food was being produced in large amounts on the island, it was being exported. It was being exported right across the British Empire. And people died, as you said, at least a million, we believe, on the island died of hunger. They were destitute, they were hungry, but they were diseased as well. And I don't know if it's properly documented, but there's expectation or evidence that there was cholera, that there were, very grim circumstances. So there were also, as a result of the crop failing, it took a decade for the crops of potatoes to come back to half of what they'd been before the famine. So there was really no prospect for people on the land in Ireland. There were mass evictions at the time, so the only route to survival was to get off the island. And the United States clearly beckoned. When you think of what was happening here in the mid-19th century, it was a sort of a no-brainer. To come in large droves, largely to the East Coast, to Boston and New York. The ports in the south, including in New Orleans, had quite a few coming in. It was easier, apparently, to get in the south without papers, but the majority of people came to the East Coast. Unusually, in terms of the complexion of the Irish who left the island, more than half were women, and they were single women who came. And they've left a very particular kind of a trace of what that generation looked like when they arrived. Many single women moved into domestic service, actually, while their male counterparts who came were in horrific menial jobs, for everything from being down at the lowest end of the mines to digging canals and railroads and suffering. A lot of the women managed to find board and lodging in houses where there were books, for example. So while some of them were, and many were, abused, they had shelter, and they were with people who were educated, and that gave at least an access on mobility. Having said that, they were difficult times for those women, but there's evidence, if you look at some of the Emigrant Savings Bank accounts going back to the mid-19th century, they were already then sending money home. Women were sending remittances home and able to bring out relatives. They were also organisers, and as the men worked on the tough jobs, they also began to organise in union and labour groups. So we moved very quickly from the horrors of the famine to getting here established and getting organised, which was sort of a first step to that political influence. So that took obviously a generation. But I will say, most of the Irish who came were, Irish speakers, so they tended to live together, not really for comfort so much as they were shunned by everyone else, so they were not welcome. And we're saying that on a day like we've had today, but Irish immigrants were certainly not welcome. But that ironically served its purpose because it also protected culture, protected tradition. It enabled them to organize themselves, and so by being in a very solid community, they somehow seemed ready for the political route, and in the end that served them well. But they never forgot where they came from. So that beginning of what we have today of 33 million Irish Americans, many of you here this evening, trace your roots back to that, by another name, Trail of Tears that we had ourselves.
And it's very interesting the way you talk about how the hardship was galvanizing for people.
What?
So it was actually, it was a mobilizing moment as well, and it did have an impact, of course, politically, as we know. And if I could sort of move into the 20th century then, and just talk about how the US was such an important ally for Ireland during the early 20th century when Ireland was in the process of achieving its own independence. And the US was effectively the first country in the world to recognize Ireland. Can you characterize the significance of that support for Ireland at the time? And I suppose it speaks to the fact of where that support came from was from the existing diaspora community.
It absolutely was. I mean, really from the moment the United States declared its independence, all of the Irish aspiring liberators looked in this direction. So there was a constant keeping an eye on what was happening. In the doc, Robert Emmett referred to, what his ambition had been was to procure for, or to secure for Ireland what Washington had procured for America. So there was always this idea that there was that city on the shining hill that we were bound for. And then when, the Irish in the early sort of 1913 to 1920 something, there was a constant stream of Irish activists out here working with the diaspora, and the diaspora, little money that they had, still helpful in fundraising. De Valera's famous a tour of the United States was fundamental. So we were galvanizing the diaspora. But if those of you who know the Proclamation of Independence that we made in 1916, it actually refers to the exiled children in America. So, on at the moment when we declared ourselves, we were looking towards the United States. We wrote the diaspora into our constitution in the 1930s. So there was always a looking in this direction. But you're right, in absolutely, political terms, the first country to recognize Ireland was the United States. And in 1924, the very first ambassador to any country, anywhere in the world from Ireland was here, a man called Timothy Smitty, who looked a lot different to me, wore a bowler hat as he went to see President Coolidge at the time. But that was a moment of extraordinary kind of confirmation of confidence that we were here, we had arrived, and the credibility the United States gave to Ireland then. Just in those early years was extraordinary. I mean, it would evolve into something much more, I want to say, tangible probably later on in terms of the support for Northern Ireland, and also then, the capacity for our economy to grow much later in partnership with the US. But those first early steps where we, as a tiny island, I often say I'm very old now. I was born in, I might as well say when I was born, I often said I was born in 1959, but the population of Ireland then was 2.9 million. We were tiny. We had been, back in famine times, 8 to 10 million. So we're the largest we've ever been. But back in the 50s and 60s, we were struggling. So that, again, looking to the United States, a lot of immigrants beginning again that export passage of our children to the United States, but it was in the interests of the state at the time to encourage that.
And US interest in Ireland and support for Ireland persisted over time. And I would point in particular, as you've mentioned, to the Northern Ireland peace process and the role that the United States played there. And it was the Irish diaspora, the Irish American community. It was politicians like members of the Kennedy clan and others. Why do you think the United States cares so deeply about Northern Ireland? And if I can add to that, do you think that level of interest is still as strong and as mobilized as ever, or is it still needed to the extent that it was needed back then?
Well, certainly on your last question, it is still needed 100%. And it's something that I spent quite a lot of time working on in Washington, because, of course, everyone knows you need help when bombs are going off in the streets and people are dying. The Good Friday Agreement is now 28 years old, so the simplistic capture is that's all over, you have an agreement, get on with it. The reality is, and in my career I spent 2 years sitting on the Security Council, where a peace agreement of a week, 10 days, 3 weeks is lauded. Having a peace agreement that's sustained over 28 years is remarkable, but it's not enough. And I think that we recognise, despite all of our effort on the island with the UK, here with the United States, that we need that ongoing partnership, and we need it for reconciliation. The International Fund for Ireland, which our wonderful Consul General steered so well for a number of years, is a prime example of how all of that work cross-border with particularly this young generation is needed. Those of you who follow the news will have seen a lot of uneasiness and violence on the streets in Belfast. The executive in Northern Ireland working well up to a point, but it's always fragile. And Northern Ireland needs economic investment, which Representative Kennedy was extraordinary in encouraging investment into Northern Ireland. But the reality is it's a job that's not done. And why we need the United States is, I myself think that without the United States, we wouldn't have peace on the island right now. And I always thank the diaspora, but also on the Hill, the bipartisan cooperation. Reagan was one of the first to mention working towards an agreement. He worked with Prime Minister Thatcher, and that wasn't easy to move ahead. So we eventually had the Anglo-Irish agreement. But we've also had extraordinary, the work that President Clinton did, Senator Micheal, and now on the Hill, the Friends of Ireland. They're my go-to touchstone, one of the most successful caucuses, and absolutely a bipartisan caucus, at a time when bipartisan is hard and it doesn't tend to work. Ireland is successfully, and particularly Northern Ireland, successfully not seen as a divisive issue. So, we make sure that when we can, that we have politicians at state level as well as at a national level come to see the enormous progress we've made in Northern Ireland, but the job that remains to be done, and that the IFI, which was defunded, to be honest, when US aid disappeared, we've managed to make the case again, hopefully going into the future, to continue that work. And we see it as the work of a generation, really.
And we've kind of talked about a lot of those events and moments that a lot of us will be familiar with. But I'm interested, when we look back now on that 250 years of a shared history, do you think there are any parts of that shared history that are maybe under-remembered?
I would say this, wouldn't I? But the role of women. I think the role of Irish women. I mentioned all those, single women coming out. But those who organise, I have a pet project in Mother Jones, Cork woman born in the Cork woman, Mary. So I've chosen the right Cork. A Cork woman born in 1837, who came out and who was a labour organiser. I mean, she went into sweatshops, she protected children against labour, she ran a miners' strike that had her dubbed the most dangerous woman in America. She was extraordinary, but she was, you know, at the visible end of a lot of women who were working for social justice, but they didn't call it that at the time. They were working in communities. They were the people who kept faith and family going, who ensured that, you know, the children weren't hungry and got some education. So I think the role of women, I mean, those women I spoke about earlier who were domestic servants, there was a pejorative term used about them called the Bridgets, the Irish Bridgets or the Irish Biddies. And a lot of women changed their name when they came. There's remarkably, anybody who's called Bridget or Mary changed their name. There's a wonderful exhibition in Portland, Maine that I saw earlier in the year dedicated to the Irish Bridgets. But those women performed, you know, really in a quiet way an extraordinary role and passed on the traditions as well of faith and family. So I think they deserve. The other one that I try to get people's attention directed to is the roots of our deep conviction in Ireland and in the United States to civil rights and human rights. And that poetic moment for me that I don't think is played enough in our minds is Frederick Douglass going to Ireland and spending a year in 1845, actually around the famine times. He saw famine in real time. But the idea that he could say it was the first time he felt like a man, and that tradition of his engagement with Daniel O'Connell, our liberator, who tried very hard but didn't liberate, but as an orator inspired Douglass and helped Douglass to articulate some of the issues that the African American community back here were still dealing with. And then you fast forward to your Northern Ireland moment where John Hume and John Lewis picked up a relationship, because the early burgeoning of the Troubles, but it was really the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, was inspired by what the civil rights movement had done here in the mid to late 60s. So we kept that link, and there's a wonderful commissioned series of paintings with Douglass and O'Connell, and then side by side with Hume and Lewis on the bridge in Derry, the Peace Bridge, remembering Selma and all that went with it. So I feel we could sort of speak more to that, because I think it's terribly relatable in terms of how we've carried our values forward.
Yeah, sure. Actually, when you speak about women and domestic service, my grandmother, the same name as me, was a domestic servant in Manhattan in the 1920s.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So I can relate to that point.
Relate to that, yeah.
Let me talk about culture maybe for a moment. To what extent do you think Ireland punches above its weight when it comes to culture here in the United States? And are there any particular genres, whether it's music or film or literature, that stand out for you in terms of their appeal and maybe even their influence here in the United States?
I mean, the word influence is important, because I think our culture, you know, we're known culturally. It's our brand. I mean, it's hard to imagine the Irish, to think of the Irish without music or dance or literature. But I think I've arrived at a lucky time, because I always say I'm as likely to be asked about the Derry Girls as I am about Yeats. You know, I mean, it's there's a whole thing going on in terms of not just how we express ourselves, but the caliber of our 21st century cultural offer is extraordinary. I mean, U2 to Hozier on the music front. You know, I'm asked all the time, do I know Paul Mescal? Wish I did, but I don't. Jessie Buckley, you know, our Oscar winner this year. We have actually invested hugely in our culture, both in terms of building up cultural industry in Ireland. You know, our film industry, our screen industry is very important. We're a go-to venue for Netflix, for some of the big studios in Hollywood in producing material for the screen. And our writers are amazing. They're writing, you know, Sally Rooney, Colm Tóibín, Colin McCann with his glorious work, and we will hear very soon from our epic poet Micheal this evening. So we have, you know, we're not short of ways of expressing what is a very 21st century Ireland. I just also say that we can do it with style. We just had a big Bloomsday at our residence where we all dressed up, and there was gorgonzola, no kidneys, but there was gorgonzola and a bit of Bordeaux, and we can still work the classical perception of who we are. But you know, this modern, confident voice in literature that makes its way to the silver screen is also, you know, another leap that we have made. You know, it's very much a calling card for Ireland now in terms of, you know, it's a universal language almost. And I'll finish up with my, you know, I spent many years as an Irish dancer. And my mom always said I was a dancer before it was profitable or sexy. So I didn't make it on the river dance trail. But we have done some really interesting work. For example, I worked with Jean Butler, the wonderful dancer who was in the original river dance, and the Juilliard School in New York, on tracing how Irish dance steps moved across the Atlantic and then across the various states and evolved. For the 250th anniversary, we are doing a cultural mapping exercise on traditional Irish music moving across the Atlantic. Wow. So we're not leaving it behind. We're using modern tools, but it's very much our brand and something I'm very proud of. Yeah.
And I can tell you, in the Boston College classroom, Derry Girls is definitely
It's
favorite.
A very clever commentary.
It's wonderful.
Really
it's
clever
wonderful.
commentary, yeah.
Just thinking about the Irish diaspora and just acknowledging that the numbers of Irish people emigrating from Ireland to the US, that those numbers are decreasing. And sort of aware that the generational connection between the two countries is maybe getting a little bit more distant. Is Irish America still a strong force? Is it still a formidable force? Or do you think it's become more symbolic?
No, I don't think it's symbolic. I think we are certainly a force to be reckoned with. You know, if you just think of it even numerically, we're 10% of the population of the United States. Italian Americans, 6%. Jewish Americans, about 3%. So, you know, we're still just numerically present and visible, so that actually counts for something. Are we the same, and are we stuck in a groove, and is it a sentimental, romantic notion, so therefore symbolic? No, actually, that's been one of the joys of this role I've had, because you really get a sense that this is an identity that's alive. You know, the Irish American identity moves as the American identity evolves. So we're in lockstep with something that's happening to the society here, but also linked back to the country in Ireland that is now totally transformed in my lifetime. I say I represent a country I did not grow up in. You know, the Ireland of today is a dynamic, progressive, socially, economically, really extraordinary. And many of the Irish American links are now their affinity through culture, for example, but also very much through business connections and business partnerships, whether it's, you know, and education indeed. The highest per capita number of students semester abroad is in Ireland. So I often meet young former semester abroad students who are not Irish American, but who completely associate now as Irish American. And we have an excellent program, for example, with Howard University in Washington, Smurfit Business School in Dublin. Those African American students come back entirely identifying as Irish American. So, you know, this is not set in stone. It's something that we will have to invest more in. And the Irish government, you know, of all the, you know, a lot of ambassadors in Washington say, well, I'd love to be the Irish ambassador in Washington because you have an entry. But I always point out that the Irish government invests in our diaspora. We have an outstanding Emigrant Support Programme, which I know the library benefits from, but community centres right across the United States. We're bringing young people into conversations in those spaces. It's a diaspora strategy. I know Minister Richmond was here earlier in the year, also a young man himself, a young politician, speaking the language of the next generation of Irish America. And, you know, so we're finding ways through business, through education, through culture. Fact is, the pipeline that we had through the 20th century of refreshing Irish America has pretty much dried up now because of the current immigration laws. There are more Americans moving to Ireland now than Irish people moving to the United States. That's the first time in our history that has been the case. So just to say it's evolving, but it's in good shape, and I'm actually optimistic rather than concerned.
Okay. I just have a couple more questions before we finish up, and one of them is about looking at the broad sweep of the America250 period, from 1776 right up to the present day. Are there Irish American figures from any walk of life who particularly stand out for you?
Well, I kind of mentioned some of them earlier. I'd have to single out Mother Jones, you know, if I leave aside those great big thinkers back in the 18th century. Mother Jones, for me, you know, did something that transformed society. She set the ground rules for engagement at labour, and then also enabled women in society. So I'd like to think that some of the organisers and women who then went on to political influence were enablers in a big way. Sitting behind this name, it's impossible to say that wasn't a tectonic plate shift when President Kennedy was elected. We all know Catholic Irish was a profile that was strongly resisted here for a long time. And I always think, you know, back to the Ireland, so it was the Ireland pretty much I was born into in the early 60s, and the notion that one of us, the people who had left in destitution, could rise to sit in that White House was completely liberating for the whole of Irish society. It was this extraordinary moment. If he could do that, anything was possible. And, you know, back in Ireland in the 60s, you know, second level education was still fee paying. We managed T.K. Whitaker and enormously sort of visionary politicians and public servants liberated our society sort of on the back of this sense of possibility. And we fast forward into the EU in the 70s. I always like to say, I think she's forgotten, so I mention her, Grace Kelly, Princess Grace, who was also, you know, very much an Irish American. Again, so we had royalty, and we had a president in the United States. For the 60s, when we really, you know, the 50s were hard times. I served as ambassador in France, and President Hollande, in a conversation, said he went to Ireland in the 50s and saw people with no shoes on them on the roads. And I was really shocked by that. But I checked it out, and he was absolutely accurate. There were, you know, rural Ireland in the 50s was desperately poor. So the Kennedy moment, and we add in Princess Grace down in Monaco, and Ireland joined the UN just around the same time. So we began to find our foreign policy voice on the stage. First thing we did when we went to the UN was we put our hand up for two things. Three actually. One was to become peacekeepers, so that, you know, we had a tiny defence force, and we raised our army from then to be peacekeepers, with, you know, serious losses in the 60s in the Congo, but we stood up on the international stage the minute we got the opportunity to. A man called Freddie Boland, Ambassador Boland, who was a predecessor of mine when I was at the UN, was the first and may always be the only president of the General Assembly. He actually was in the chair the day that Khrushchev took off his shoe and hit the podium. And then the other powerful thing we did, and while I was ambassador at the UN, we still carried, I would say, the admiration of other countries for that, is that we promoted nuclear non-proliferation. And we were known as the, if you like, the lead country in the nuclear non-proliferation debate. And look where we are now. So that was a period that I think we kind of lost sight of as a critical moment.
Yeah. I think it's a great point you make, though. When we think about home and the cities and the suburbs and the townlands and the rural areas, some of those places, it's extraordinary to think that people came from those places and made such a tremendous success of their lives here and made such a contribution. And I suppose it's because we know those places that it makes it all the more real. My final question, we've talked a lot about how the US has been good to Ireland and good for Ireland. Can I switch that a little bit and ask you, do you think that maybe today there are any lessons the US might take from Ireland at this juncture in our respective histories?
Should I answer that, do you think? I'm very attached to my job. Look, I think one of the characteristics that we risked as a society almost losing in Ireland, but I think we have gone back on track, is the solidarity and the community sense at the heart of our society. You know, we continue, I think the recent experience with Ukraine for me was a great expression of that. You know, there's a war in our backyard in Europe. People, you know, sometimes here I was back in Ireland last week and I was thinking, gosh, it's very present. You know, you forget that there are people dying on the continent of Europe in a real war. But I sat on the Security Council the night that Putin attacked Ukraine. And that night in February 2022, there really were no Ukrainians in Ireland. Today, it's 2% of our population is Ukrainian. Over 115,000 Ukrainians have come to Ireland, and they have just been absorbed into our society. A lot of them women and children, because men had to stay in Ukraine, but there are kids in schools right across Ireland. They're playing Gaelic football, they're speaking Irish, they're doing Irish dance. They've been welcomed, they've been given access to our social security system. They are of us until they find their way home. And I think that because we've depended ourselves for so many generations on the kindness of strangers, that's something that's baked into our society, and I hope that never changes. And the other thing I would say, you know, that we are deeply attached to, and that's shaky internationally right now, is the notion of international cooperation and the rule of law. And I had the privilege of being on the state capitol today, meeting with the Trade Commission, the Massachusetts Trade Commission. We were talking about, you know, Ireland, extraordinary, we're the 5th source of FDI into the United States, 200,000 jobs here, funded by Irish investors. But those investors are saying to me, it's a little bit shaky, we're uncertain if decisions change, business likes certainty, and many of you from the business community. But business also likes to know that contracts are observed and the rule of law is respected. A small country like Ireland can never, ever afford not to depend on the rule of law. So we will always promote and respect that. We're Europeans, we assume the presidency of the European Union on the 1st of July, and we will push that notion of respect for international order and the rule of law, because it's in our interest, of course, but we believe it's in the collective interest, the common good of international societies. We've relied on the United States to be a bulwark in all of that over the entire period of our state, over 100 years now. So we want to continue to rely on that.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time to come to Boston to have this conversation in this wonderful space. And in particular, just for the reflection that you gave us and the time that you spent to do that, thinking, in a deep way about the meaning of this anniversary for both Ireland and for the United States. So
it's been a pleasure to be with you, Mary.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. You go down, I think, yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Professor Murphy. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move to the cultural dimension of this evening. And I have to tell you, we've got a real treat for you here this evening. Many of you in this room will have attended the wonderful festival of traditional Irish music that took place here in Boston in April, drawing from the well and also featuring tunes on the Charles. It really, really was a wonderful event with showcasing the best of Irish traditional music. And we're really hopeful that it will become an annual event. And so it's my pleasure this evening to introduce a very special traditional music performance, and I see the musicians taking the stage now, featuring some of those musicians who are part of the Drawing from the Well programme. This evening we have Sean Clohessy on fiddle, we have Colin Cadis on the button accordion, and we have John Coyne on that very Irish instrument, the bouzouki. We're also very honoured this evening to have the very distinguished poet, Micheal O'Shiel, who's going to perform a special poem which he was commissioned to write in celebration of 250 years of our shared U.S. Irish heritage. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to hand over to our musicians now. Guramila Mahagav.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to play for everybody this evening. We're going to play a couple of sets. We're going to start with a set of jigs. The first tune is called Brendan Tonra's Jig. Brendan Tonra was a fantastic fiddle player who was born in Mayo, in County Mayo, and learnt a lot of his music there. And then as a young man, I guess in the 50s, moved over and settled here in Boston. Played a lot of music here in Boston, met many of the local musicians and many of the musicians that travelled from all parts of Ireland and settled here on the East Coast. And he was a most wonderful composer of Irish music, much of which travelled back to Ireland and is part of the repertoire there today. And he won the T.G. Cahir Composer of the Year, Commodore Micheal. And so we'll start with that tune, and then we'll follow it with another jig called the Mug of Brown Ale. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Thank you. A few little jigs there. As you just heard, and I'm sure as many of you attended at least there at the beginning of May, we had a most fantastic celebration of Irish music here in Boston with the tunes on the Charles, which myself and Colin Cadis here and a great friend of ours, Jackie O'Reilly, a wonderful dancer based here in Boston, put together. And it was really fantastic. We had the great opportunity to have our friends from the Traditional Irish Music Archive who put together the drawing from the Well concerts and run them annually in the National Concert Hall in Ireland, come over and partner with us here in Boston to really celebrate the music and the culture and the dance and the songs and the storytelling that is so much a part of our community here. And it was something that myself and Colin and Jackie really wanted to bring to Boston, because there are so many festivals all over the US that celebrate Irish music and culture. And Boston did have the couple of festivals in the past based down in Boston College, and we had music in Canton, but there's such a vibrant culture of music and song and dance here in Boston at the moment that it was really deserving to be celebrated. And the other aspect that we really wanted to share was to try and have some of the folks in Ireland really come here and experience that and see how it's lived and how it is so much part of the community and what we do here. So it's great to be able to be here and share a little bit of that with you as well. Well, we're going to play another set to finish up here. We will play a tune to start that has another Mayo connection. This time, rather than tunes traveling from Boston to Ireland, this is a tune that was composed by a girl, Holly Garrity, who's from Mayo. And her sister Kelly is now living in Boston and brought this tune with her. It's a tune called Plankstead Dermot Grogan, composed in honor of another Mayo musician who passed away 20 years ago this year at the very young age of 48, and was a terrible loss to the music community, both here in the US as well as in Ireland. And we'll follow that up with a couple of lively reels. Lucy Campbell's and Anderson's. Thank you very much, folks.
Good evening, and I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this wonderful evening of celebration of what we Irish have contributed as we celebrate 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. I'm greatly honoured and indeed very proud to have been commissioned to write a poem to mark the occasion. The poem was commissioned by Kevin Sullivan on behalf of the Irish American250. Now, as I sat this morning in Penn Station before coming to Boston, I got an urgent text from Kevin to say, please don't forget to mention that there'll be another event in Bowling Green on the 9th of July when they will be celebrating the first reading by Washington of the Declaration of Independence. So I've done my bounden duty. But before I read the commissioned poem, I'd like to read 3 poems on the theme of emigration from Ireland. Now, rather than read poems which I have written, which would reinforce some of the general themes so eloquently discussed by the ambassador and by Professor Murphy, I'll read 3 short poems which tell of my own personal experience of emigration. My America story is simple. I fell in love with a New Yorker and came to America to marry her and make my home. If you like, I'm a love exile. Take off. But never before a one-way flight. The turbos gather runway speed as years behind me now recede. What life's still mine will love requite. But so much yet I won't forget, yet never let my heart compare. I cannot live both here and there. Fare forward, travellers, don't regret. What was in thanks I bring with me. Unlike Lot's wife, I don't look back. To crave the past, a cul-de-sac. What is must shape all yet to be. A flight that's smooth, no trough or turbulence. Oh, yes, I trust. Will fate shake off bygones, gold dust? Though fluttering now as we lift off, I fly to dream another home. Let mañana in Manhattan home. For full-hearted me, and here I come, to do as Romans do in Rome. I know my mind, the die is cast. So let the months, the years slip by. Like frost, I'll tell this with a sigh, when destiny becomes a past. Another life lived hand in glove, I'm traveling westward to embrace. No matter what, that tender face, home, now how I'm loved and love. For me, there was always a wistfulness, a sort of loneliness, a strange longing attached to the idea of emigration. Shortly after settling in New York, while walking in a park by the East River, I could somehow hear within me the tone of those plaintive emigrant songs sung by those who in those times knew they never would return. Echoes. First weeks I walk an Upper East Side park, as slowly new tomorrows dawn on me. Is it here that I'll live out my days? How many million ghosts still disembark to roll the dreaming dice of destiny? O land of wanderers and emigres, sing Bon Chric Éireann O or Spancil Hill. Your longing cries had often made me grieve for all who left and never would return. But I have come here of my own free will, and following my mending heart, I thieve more years of joy. For what would I now yearn? as month by month I stroll this park that veers and curves along the waterfront to where a swoop of homing pigeons peck and coo. Day in, day out, as months now count their years, in this my second life I walk on air. What could I ever now regret or rue? Yet exile songs still echo deep within. It's not that I blank out or cast aside my island's history bred in the bone, the sacred memories of kith and kin. But now is now, and I have hit my stride. This Upper East Side Park I make my own. Whenever here in this country I meet for the first time someone from Ireland, one of the first questions we ask each other is, how long are you here and why we came? For so many in the past, the only why was that they had little choice. I'm so grateful that I'm an immigrant who came of my own volition. By chance. Meeting my compatriots by chance, somehow we inquire at once when and why we came. Some ambitions steered to come, while others tell how they arrived for 1 year and stayed. Millions of us came before, who might ask when, but never why. Needs that must the devil drove. New York's tenements began at Mott Street, number 65, 7 stories high, parlor and a living room, 2 narrow bedrooms, oil-lit, housing families. More spring up on neighboring streets as crammed in slums our coffin-shipped lived and worked and died. Fellow islanders, give thanks that we are exile volunteers, migrants by desire. City of my second life, careerist of the heart, I came here to home. And I'll conclude with the commissioned poem, Irish America 250, which, as I mentioned, I wrote to celebrate the contribution we Irish have made to this country. Irish America. On that July 4th, we too were there, deeply braided in this country's weave. Through 250 years, we now can share pride in all our crowd came to achieve. Rising from outsiders' demimonde, toast how children's children would in turn journey to acceptance and beyond, dreams for which our forebears had to yearn. Yes, we know the turns of fortune's wheel, pains and glories of our slow ascent, misbegotten moons of dark O'Neill, Famine's great-grandson, a president, vibrant weft in our new world's brocade, honor now the role our people played. Some 200,000, maybe more, curbed by penal laws or Anne's Test Act, fled our island, hived here years before colonists at Lexington attacked, firing shots that rang the world around, bent on independence they had lacked. Some of ours, recruits still duty-bound to the British troops, but few compared with our early settlers who had found Catholic and dissenter both here shared common ground in fighting England's Anne. We salute our heroes, those who dared, Generals John Stark and Sullivan, Mulligan, New York's shrewd Taylor Mole, Commodore John Barry, Wexford man. England's Parliament learn of our role. Their America was lost to emigrants. We now share this country's restless soul. From Portrush Belfast, Newry or Coleraine, weary of the established church disdain, Ulster's Presbyterians we'll sail, seek religion's freedom's holy grail, dream through dangerous months at sea of where we, a border folk with bliss warfare in our genes, will settle buffer zones. Kirk democracy too in our bones, we'll obey our leaders, but we spurn all aristocrats who also then in turn brand us as rednecks or as white trash. Stubborn, self-reliant, seldom rash, we are Wilsons, Smiths, Montgomerys, Adams, Webbs, Buchanans, McAfees. Feeling in New England we intrude, first in Philadelphia, but imbued with a warrior competitiveness. It's the wagon road, the wilderness road. We'll push then south and west from Virginia on our tireless quest. We will be the frontiersmen who are bred to use a gun. Aggressively we'll spread Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, route the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee. Fighting Red Sticks or Brits at New Orleans, Orphan Jackson, soldier in his teens, warring hero with populist descent, our first democratic president. Privilege Kerber, Chancellor of Debt, savior of the Union, yes, and yet brutal driver of the Trail of Tears. In the South, we Ulstermen become, over time, strong Baptists, also some Methodists, who too will understand. We'll be the keepers of this Bible land. Even now, our kirk and frontier kind still will hew a southern cast of mind. Come Black 47's tuber blight, starving and evicted, hollow-eyed, crammed in ship-sick holes, a million came, hoping for no more than to survive. In New York or Boston most remain, better squalor than the fickle soil. Who would trust to crops that so betray? By design or by default we stay to endure the poverty and toil, nursing fears, such famines still ingrain. Here the lucky millions still alive, Mix and Bridget's nativist's nickname, Shanty Irish, wasps and snobs deride. In slum tenements, a living plight. So God be with the failed Potato Ridge. We'll dig the subways, build the Brooklyn Bridge. We'll shovel and we'll swing the pick and axe. We'll cut canals or lay the railroad tracks. We'll be the city's fireman or the cop. In craft unions back the tight clothes shop. Young single girls as maids will find their feet, work for the Boston or New York elite, who otherwise would never wish to mix with immigrants who are Irish Catholics. In parishes, a counter-world where we'll create a village life and feel, nuns will see the seeds of welfare sown, build schools and hospitals first for their own. The priests run dances in the parish hall, while we'll seek the old stock's slow downfall. The bosses and ward healers, the machine whose good turns in saloons or the shebeen will garner votes and so will circumvent the denizens of the establishment and induce a mindset out of date to let all immigrants now integrate. Then, when the age of Tammany Hall is gone, we'll enter the professions and move on. In all fields are gifts and none are badge. Mayors, governors, those who move and shake. Presidents seek Irish lineage, kinships though far back and now opaque. What once signaled famine immigrant has become a take-for-granted name. Mainstream, now secure and confident, ours are roots that millions want to claim. Watch with joy the bright screen's credits scroll. Cagney, Clooney, Kelly, Power, O'Brien. On they come to snatch a title role. Nason, Brosnan, Ronan, Farrell, Ryan. Woven in this history's dreamscape, celebrate a land that we still shape. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. What an incredible evening of history, of partnership, of shared culture and poetry. We're just so grateful to be able to have this night with you all tonight in a beautiful June evening. We are now concluded. The event is concluded, and we hope we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.